Good day everyone, I'm Cortez from BS Architecture 2C, one of the reporters of Group 4. Me and my fellow groupmates, Jerah Domingo and Estipular, will be going to discuss Sigmund Freud's theory on id, ego, and superego. To fully understand Freud's theory, on the left side is an example of an image of a person with an angel on its one shoulder, representing the superego, and a devil on the other shoulder, representing the id. On the right picture is an illustration by giving a metaphor of an iceberg. Now when you look at the iceberg, a lot of its mass is below the surface where we can't really see. And if we look at the top, we can see the ego. This is based on the level in which we can access the information in our mind. Right next to it is the superego. Now, this is more on a preconscious level. It's outside of our awareness, but it is still accessible to the information. And finally, deep below the surface lies on the unconscious mind. It is an area in which we can't readily access. However, it is flooded with emotions and motivations that do impact our actions. Now let's start by defining id. It is the most basic part of the personality that seeks instant gratification for our wants and needs. And if these needs and wants are not met, a person can become tense, anxious, or angry. Also, id is a reservoir of our unconscious psychic energy that strives to satisfy basic sexual and aggressive drives. The id engage in primary process thinking, which is primitive, illogical, irrational, and fantasy-oriented.
Ego. The ego is the decision-making part of the mind. It also seeks pleasure, but uses reason and logic to do so. It tries to get the unrealistic id to cooperate in a society bound by laws and social norms. The ego is one of the three components of personality in Freud's psychoanalytic theory. The ego is the second component of personality to develop, usually around the ages of 2 to 3 years old. The ego is responsible for sorting out what is real. It helps us make sense of our thoughts and the world around us. It is the component of our personality we are aware of the most. This is because the ego is the part that controls our consciousness. We experience 3 levels of consciousness according to Freud. These levels are unconsciousness outside of our awareness at all times. The second is pre-consciousness, knowledge and memories we can retrieve. And consciousness, our current awareness. The ego exists in all 3 levels, but is the main component of our current awareness. For example, imagine yourself in the middle of an argument between 2 of your friends. One friend wants you to go to a party. The other friend thinks that you should stay at home and study for a test you have coming up. You want to find a way to keep both of your friends happy. So you came up with a compromise. You will study for an hour and then go to the party later. In this example, your actions are similar to the ego. Why? Because the ego is the psychological component of the personality that is represented by our conscious decision-making process. So we have here an illustration on how they work together. The id, I want chocolate. The ego, eat a small bar of chocolate. The superego, you're on a diet. The id is an unconscious part of our personality. It is basically the childish and impulsive part of ourselves that just does what it wants, and it wants things really intensely and doesn't really think about the consequence. The ego is controlled by what is called the reality principles. This is the idea that the desires of the id must be satisfied in a method that is both socially appropriate and realistic, while the superego is the part of you that's super judgmental and moralizing and is always trying to get you to behave in a socially and appropriate way.
Superego, the voice that incorporates the values and morals which are learned from one parents and society. It tries to persuade the ID and ego to turn to moral goals rather than seeking pleasure. Superego is a preconscious. Why? Based on the description said that in incorporates the values and morals, and persuade, the idea turns to moral goals. It is the internal judge based on the moral principle. The superego tells you what's right and wrong, what's socially acceptable to do things according to real-world rules, moral, and norms. And it is ideal. Why? Because before we do something, he tends to plan it, considering everything that would possible to happen.
So that's all. Thank you.